Good afternoon. My name is Michael Petley. I'm the chairman of the Global Macro Economic and Policy Unit at the ECU Group, which incorporates some of the financial industry's most respected economists, policy advisors, and market strategists. Following David Cameron's famous Bloomberg speech in 2013, I led a team of economists, including former economic advisors to the UK Treasury and the IMF, that produced the independent, in-depth economic insights for Business for Britain's comprehensive report, Change or Go. This considered all aspects of the UK's past, current, and future relationship with the European Union. This report, extending to over 1,000 pages, and covered all aspects of the UK economy in the underlying structural, demographic, technological, geopolitical, and economic trends, both within the EU and globally. We looked at the UK inside the European Union, as well as contemplating a future for the UK outside of the EU. We assessed what was right and wrong with the EU and considered whether it was indeed fit for purpose in the 21st century, or whether it had become a relic of the past, merely a 1970s solution to a 1950s problem. We considered the wider impact of economic and monetary union in Europe, and considered whether it was a price worth paying, and over the long run, whether indeed it is sustainable. We analysed an alarming increase in economic divergence within the EU and the structural and cultural differences which exacerbate such. We came to certain inescapable conclusions based upon simple financial, economic, and social realities in the 21st century, rather than political bias and wishful thinking. It is evident that the EU bureaucracy and protectionist policies are eroding the EU's competitiveness in today's globalized world, stifling business potential, investment, and jobs. We found that the UK had a suboptimal trading relationship with the EU, where UK services, amounting to near 80% of our economy, are stymied by hidden barriers to trade. It's important to remember 99% of UK companies are small and medium-sized enterprises, only 6% of which trade with the EU at all, but 100% of which are subject to the EU's rules and regulations. The UK trade with the EU is on an unremitting downward trend, and it's clear that the UK's greater economic interests lie on a globalisation path and not the EU's regionalisation model, which has become increasingly protectionist and uncompetitive. Despite this, the UK is not at liberty to negotiate its own trade deals, since the EU has supremacy over these, and it's really not very good at achieving them. Other countries outside the EU, like Switzerland, Singapore, South Korea, and Chile even, have established trade agreements with economies that collectively are 5 to 10 times the size with which the EU, after all these years, has managed to secure trading agreements. The future is big, and the future is global. Far from opting to be little Englanders, a vote to leave the EU opens the UK up to economies 4 times the size of the EU, and more importantly, where GDP growth dwarfs that of the entrenched lackluster growth in the EU. One of the key issues from an economic perspective, as opposed to matters concerning sovereignty, democracy, immigration, security, etc., surrounds the construct and viability of monetary union and the single currency within Europe. Our overwhelming conclusion is that the Eurozone and the single currency, as presently constructed, is simply unsustainable. Without major change in construct and approach, we conclude that it is likely that EMU, like so many other monetary unions before it, will fail in its present form and that the European Union will break apart. Consequently, next week's referendum is actually less about remaining in or leaving the EU as we know it, but far more relevantly about whether or not we wish to remain in something that the EU is set to become, or has to become, in order for the Eurozone to survive. What must surely be apparent to everyone by now is that economic and monetary union, encompassing the majority of the EU, has been an unmitigated, yet wholly predictable and well-prophesized disaster. By prioritizing political expediency over a steady framework involving a more rational and durable social and economic pragmatism, this generation's political elite have put at risk the very tenets and goals of the EU founders. The overriding reality is that without a fiscal union, which in effect would require a political union, the financial, social, and economic strains within the Eurozone will prove to be unsurmountable. The imbalance is explicitly clear. The construct of the Eurozone, as we have it at present, is simply not sustainable. No ifs, no buts, it will break. Whilst the UK is not a member of the Eurozone, the EU has become synonymous with being in the Eurozone, whatever Mr. Cameron may try and have us believe. For all his opt-outs, blocking votes, and purported special deals for the UK, not only do these amount to very little, this misses the bigger picture. All non-Eurozone members of the EU, bar Britain and Denmark, are obligated to adopt the single currency. In practice, it will be us and them, with all political capital spent on their vision of the future, not ours. We will become a backseat passenger in a bus going in a direction we simply do not want to go. They can hear, but they do not listen. They certainly do not act, and we will be impotent to enforce anything. It's time to get real. Most of the more natural prerequisites for a successful monetary union, as history has taught us from a road littered with failed currency unions and artificial pegs, were simply not appropriately in place when economic and monetary union and the single currency were introduced. Despite such, the EU political hierarchy has thus far chosen to stick its head in the sand, ignore its critics, disregard some of the most perilous and unsustainable deficiencies, and press on regardless, no matter how compelling and obvious the need for reform and change. To those outside of the European Union, this position continues to be utterly bewildering. There can be no doubt that these deficiencies opened up the EU, and particularly the EMU constituents of the EU, which have adopted the single currency, to a depressingly unlevel playing field, which has deeply exacerbated the structural, economic, and social divergences within the EU. Consequently, the strong countries, like Germany, simply get stronger, and the weaker ones, which simply may not ever have what it takes to compete head-to-head with a Germany in today's globalized world, simply get ever weaker. The Eurozone needs to integrate or it will disintegrate, pure and simple. I'm equivocally clear Britain's long-term interests are best served by not getting drawn further into the inexorable journey into either of these two scenarios. I'm clear that our interests are best served by us leaving the EU at this juncture and recalibrating our economy onto a more diversified global path, free to follow where the growth and opportunities lie, and where the UK can play to its proven strengths. So on the 23rd of June, I will be voting to leave the European Union, and I invite you to do the same.